Today, I'm very excited to have Matt Kappadakunnel join me to have a conversation about our books that were recently published. Matt's book, The Catholic Church and the Struggle for Racial Justice, was published in April by Paulist Press, and my book, In the Shadow of Freedom, The Enduring Call for Racial Justice, was published in May by Orbis Books. In my upbringing as an African American person in America, I have always felt like an other, or as Pope Francis has termed, an existential foreigner, even though my father's roots as an African American are very deep. My mother is from South Africa, and her family left the country in the 60s when she was 10 years old because my grandfather was politically exiled for his anti-apartheid activism. So people might not know by simply looking at me, but I also know what it's like to have an immigrant parent. And Matt, will you discuss your experience growing up as a first generation American that you discuss in your book?
Sure. Thank you, Alessandra. And the more I reflect on this question, I realize how many layers there are to it. My parents are from the state of Kerala in South India. Kerala is known for where Thomas the Apostle came and evangelized to the Indian people there. And so my parents, are among many of these what we call Syrian Christians or the early Christian church that originated in India, and even going back even further, my parents can trace their ancestry to the Jewish Christians that had a migration from called Jerusalem, Syria, Iraq, and then down to uh, Kerala. So they took the same route that Thomas the Apostle did. So I already have, I'm South Indian, I'm Catholic. My parents moved to Louisiana, of all places, which is not known for a ton of Indians. They're in a very remote place outside of Lafayette, Louisiana. My dad was at the time, teaching accounting at a small offshoot college of LSU. And so immigrant parents often have this question: do we share kind of in depth a culture with our children, or do we try to Americanize them as much as possible? Without having grandparents living in the same house, and it's a large network of other Indians around us. We had an aunt and uncle, but that was about it. My parents chose to do the latter, to have us Americanized, to not learn their language, to basically just take my upbringing as if I was just any other American. So despite that, it was pretty innate to me that I was an outsider. I definitely was an outsider amongst the people in societal settings, in church settings, but then even more so just within the Indian community in a way, because I didn't grow up speaking the language. So a lot of the Indian families and Indian Americans who did speak the language often felt as if I had a disadvantage or I was not really brought up the right way. And then further, going to India, I definitely stood out as someone who was born and raised in America and very Americanized. So in India, I didn't fit in. So I didn't fit in India, didn't fit in with Indian Americans. And then you take it another layer. Many of the Indian population here in the US, they're mainly Hindu, to a lesser extent Muslim, larger population from North India than South India. So I'm already an outsider in that regard too. I'm not Hindu or Muslim. I'm not from North India. So in pretty much almost every direction, I felt like an outsider.
Mhm.
But kind of more in line with this theme, my upbringing as a Catholic Christian, I just found myself in circles where I was often the outsider. Whether it be in elementary school, most of the students in the school I went to, they were actually of Mexican American descent, but still here am I as one of a few Indians. And it was, again, the sense of I'm something different, I'm something other. Then in high school, I spent about a year and change at an all boys Catholic school. And I would say that actually had a lot more of a racial undertone. There was a larger percentage of white Catholics there, and they would often target people of Indian descent and they would call me and others names like Habib and other really disgraceful names like that. And that was kind of my impression that, hey, even in my own church, I'm not welcome. I'm not seen as someone who can be fully myself. I've had various experiences of religious life. I was in a small religious order that based in Omaha that's no longer in existence. I was in the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, for a little over than 3 years. And while that's an order that definitely promotes social justice, I certainly felt like an outsider being one of maybe two Indians in my province, and the whole U.S. consistency, there's just not even a handful. So just that feeling of being an outsider, I almost felt like where do I fit in within the greater plan of God? Where do I fit in the church? Where do I fit in society? And it's almost goes back to the scripture passage, the stone rejected by the builders is the cornerstone. And that was kind of my sense of grounding, that actually these experiences lead me closer to Christ and lead me to become more like Christ, lead me to understand those who experience rejection, oppression, and align myself better. So it's definitely been a difficult experience, but it's been a grace filled experience that has allowed me to grow in my faith and grow as a disciple of Christ.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that experience and how you feel that you've been drawn closer to Christ because of your experience. So talking a little bit about my background, I've always known about the African American struggle for racial justice and like the South African struggle for racial justice. And I think for many Black children in America, it's part of our upbringing to learn about the civil rights movement. And we're cautioned about the limitations that may be put on us as Black Americans. And especially with like me having three Black sons and a Black daughter, you have to have the talk with them about if you get pulled over by the police or if you encounter a police officer, just things like that. And in the introduction to my book, I discuss experience somewhat similar to yours, where my youngest or my oldest son was the only Black student in his Catholic first grade um, class, and he ended up being targeted by the teacher for being African American. So for African Americans, anti-Black racism can start at a very young age, and as you described, for immigrants you know, the feeling alienated or othered can start at a very young age. Um, but I wanted you to address how in your book you talk about your own change of heart and mind and stance when it came to immigration at the southern border. And you also talk about speaking out against anti-Black racism during 2020 and how that was new for you also. So, could you discuss how what you term being the model minority made it somewhat taboo for you to speak out about racism, um, and and just how you wrote about that a little bit in your book?
Sure, thank you. Kind of going back to how, at least in my upbringing, the focus on was on fitting in, being Americanized, and really not rocking the boat in that regard. And I feel like a lot of people from Asian American backgrounds, Indian American or South Asian backgrounds. That's kind of the pressures that our parents or really even societal just put on us. The focus on, hey, as long as you do well in school, your path is paved before you. Just do well in school, you'll get a good job, you'll excel in society, and it's all about how hard you work, and that's what's drilled into us. None of the sense of, well, there's any differentiation based on our race or color. It's almost like those notions are pushed aside with favor of, look at how as long as you get in the right schools, as long as you get the right job. But in reality, that's just not the case. I mean, I even think back to my parents saying how certain people would be promoted ahead of them, and despite not having the same skill set or same background. And there's almost this undercurrent pressure, and I didn't quite understand until I read about this term called the model minority myth, where you get people from this upbringing where we're just taught that, hey, there's don't rock the boat, do well in school, you'll get a great job. There's really no discrimination based on your color or your background. and everything will be fine. And any notion that seems to contradict it, we're just kind of implicitly taught to just push it aside or not really give it a place, but mainly not to rock the boat. We don't want to be the ones telling, yeah, we're basically have this place in society where we are liked for who we are and the place we are, but if we deviate from that place, then we're not in a place of favor. So as long as we're the ones who put our head down, study, become a doctor, an engineer, or whatever, then you're doing the right thing. You're doing the American way. If you're out there kind of challenging the system, doing what Gandhi did, let's just say, then there's not really a place for us there. And I actually saw this not just in a societal way, but within the church, where I'm thinking back to my teens, my 20s, the focus was on if you want to be a good Catholic, you have to be a conservative Catholic. You got to listen to all these apologetic speakers. You got to do what Scott Hahn is doing or saying. You got to do what Jesse Romero is doing or saying. And that was the one way. And then not only are they talking about the truths of the church, but all of a sudden they're seeping in other things that aren't necessarily about the church, but more political and ideological in nature. For instance, it could be about immigration. It could be about why are these people coming over? Why can't they go the legal way? And then that becomes ingrained in my head. Well, my parents came the legal way. Why can't others? And for me, trying to be a good Catholic, I thought that also meant adhering to some of these ideological tones. But it really wasn't until I was a Jesuit novice, so the kind of the early phase of Jesuit formation, studying to be a priest. I was down at the southern border in Nogales, working with it's a Jesuit work, a Jesuit apostolate called El Comedor, the kitchen, the dining table, where there's migrants from Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, so not just Mexico, that are trying to cross the border. They get turned away, and this apostolate gives them food, it gives them support. There's prayer, there's fellowship, and some of them try again. They try to cross the border. What I learned from this experience, most of these people are good people that just want a better life. If they stay in El Salvador, their family will get killed. They're dealing with narco traffickers, they're dealing with other gangs, they're dealing with other areas of violence. Then, in conjunction with that, I spent 3 months in Honduras. It seemed like every day I heard about someone getting held up, someone getting shot, and these are locals. It was very dangerous to be walking around, whether it be just myself as uh, a non-native or just being a native Honduran. So seeing that this is the experience that they have, why wouldn't they try to flee? Why wouldn't they try to go to another country? Why wouldn't they try to get in the U.S.? Hey, it's either die in the desert crossing or get kicked out for trying to cross, or maybe getting in versus staying in your own home country and having your family members killed or having yourself killed. And then there's the economic side where these people really have nothing. They don't have money, they don't have jobs, they don't have a way to take care of themselves. And then here in the US, while we're not abounding in jobs, we certainly have more to offer. And these people have services and skills that they can give. So it's really shameful when we look at the bigger picture and understand their story, especially from a Catholic Christian lens, how we are just generalizing these people as, oh, they're illegals or they're murderers or drug traffickers. And that's 99.9% not the case. And then from a back to the Catholic Christian perspective, how do we see Christ in this? And how would Christ view these people? And I keep turning to the Good Samaritan. It's how is God calling a foreigner to respond to someone in need, and who is my neighbor? It's pretty clear in the gospel how we should act, and it's also clear that there are many in the church, very prominent voices, who are not aligned with Christ in that message.
Absolutely. Um, and I think in my book, I argue that racism goes against Christian teaching because it denies the innate dignity of Black people and people of color. And I think what you're talking about is that the xenophobia also denies the inherent dignity of the immigrants or who are trying to seek a better life or asylum seekers, and seeking asylum is a legal right. Um, but one thing I wanted to ask you about is that you very eloquently in your book make the case that racism is the antithesis of Catholicism. And you point out the word Catholic, as most Catholics know, means universal. So will you discuss your views on this?
Sure. And it was really fortuitous. So during the pandemic, a group of us, just a group out of Twitter, of Catholic Twitter, decided to read a book by Henri de Lubac, called Catholicism. It's a book that had been sitting on my shelf for 2 decades. He was very prominent during the Second Vatican Council. And first I thought, oh man, this is going to be a boring book. Then I started reading it, and it was just the opposite. He's integrating all these ideas from the church fathers and their understanding of Catholicism. So church fathers were historically a heck of a lot closer to Jesus and the apostles than we are. So they're certainly a great source to look for when it comes to understanding what the church is, who the church is. And de Lubac showed that the church fathers really had this understanding of multicultural dimension of the church, and that universality is not just the language, as many centuries in the church were in Latin, but in the sense of the church being in every country and the body of Christ. The membership of the church is every race, every person in their uniqueness, in their original way that as created by God. There's an amazing line that de Lubac quotes from St. John Chrysostom, that the one in Rome ought to look at the one in India and see him as his brother. And I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And do we see our church members do that today? Not quite. It's really this understanding that the church has different expressions. The church, while being one, part of that oneness stems from the innate dignity of it, the multicultural expression. So the liturgies in Africa, the Syro-Malabar liturgies that are done in where my parents are from, in South India, while they different appearance, they express the diverse and unique and multifaceted nature of the church, kind of limiting it to an ethnocentric or a Eurocentric version of the church that's kind of been distilled down into American Catholicism as the way, really limits our understanding, our experience, our identity of the church, of being Catholic. We're not living fully up to our vocation, up to our baptismal calling by living in that way. We're not even reflecting who we are as Catholics by acting that way. So it really comes down to, are we being universal? Are we being multicultural? Are we being inclusive into the different cultural expressions of how the gospel is being manifested? And I really give credit to a lot of the missionaries who were able to do that, because a lot of the European missionaries just kind of took what they had in Europe and just kind of hammered it down on the people in South America and Asia. And then you have some other missionaries like Matteo Ricci, for instance, the Jesuit missionary, who actually took the opposite approach. He said, well, let me understand the Chinese culture. Let me understand what's important to them, and how can I present Christ in a way that is respective of their understanding of the world and understanding and their cultural upbringing. So that's really the true essence of being Catholic, is not limiting the Spirit, but allowing the Spirit to express in the manifold ways, just as God created us in manifold ways, whether it be we're all unique, even if we're of the same ethnicity, and then among other ethnicities, there's still that sense of that inherent unique dignity that each of us, we still reflect the face of God, no matter how different we may appear. And so it really goes back to, I look at the four tenets of the church: one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. if we allow racism to penetrate the church, then we're divided, so we're not one. Racism is a sin that divides, as the U.S. bishops proclaimed in one of their encyclicals. So we can't be holy if we allow racism to persist. We're not Catholic because then we go against the universality, the multicultural dimension of the church. We're not apostolic. Jesus calls the disciples and all of us to go out to the whole world and preach the gospel. Well, if we are regarding people as less than, then we are also saying that they are not worthy of the full expression of the gospel. If we're not, if we do not believe that each person that we are ministering to, that we are seeking to proclaim the good news to, is not a child of God, does not have the inherent dignity of God, then we go against the gospel that we preach. So yeah, racism really attacks the heart of the essence of what it means to be Catholic, what it means to be a member of this of the body of Christ.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about something that you mentioned a little bit when it came to like the European missionaries. And on my YouTube channel, I've had the opportunity to interview Dr. Ansel Augustine and Father Christopher Keller about their own books. Both are out with Orbis also that deal with the topic of racism. And the truth is that the Catholic Church has promulgated very harmful racist ideas, and people who call themselves Catholic have perpetuated racist acts like enslaving Black people or colonizing indigenous peoples, and to this day, harboring racist viewpoints. In the first chapter of my book, I discussed the Kingdom of Congo converting to Catholicism before Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas, but how both the Vatican and the Portuguese stood as barriers to the African nation being fully incorporated into the church with a Vatican See. And the reality that the Portuguese were much more interested in exploiting Africans to capture and sell them into slavery than proselytizing people to come to the faith. And I think we can also say with missionaries, a lot of times they did not look at the people in the Americas or India or Asia as full humans with their own cultures, their own religious beliefs, but looked at them as barbaric or whatever, and wanted to tell them the quote unquote truth and force their beliefs on them. So, how do you reconcile your beliefs about the anti-racist principles of Catholicism and the historical reality of the Catholic Church and the countries and people who were Catholic, but especially when it comes to slavery and colonization? And for example, you mentioned you were briefly in the Society of Jesus formation, discerning becoming a priest. And in Christopher Keller's book, he mentions how the Society of Jesus was the religious organization that owned the most enslaved people, 20,000. So how do you kind of reconcile these things?
Yeah, that's a very deep and hard reckoning. It's you mentioned Father Christopher Keller. He was 2 years after me entering the Jesuits, but we were at the same novitiate, Grand Coteau, Louisiana. And I remember an older Jesuit, relatively older, telling us that at the time the Jesuits owned all the land in Grand Coteau and everybody in it, and that implied the slaves that were also there. And it was kind of a even then it was like our kind of shocking to hear that, and kind of in that same vein, although not having as much of a shock effect, when I was doing my 30-day spiritual exercises, I was doing spiritual reading. Francis Xavier at the time was a very important saint to me. One of the early Jesuits, Ignatius, had a strong friendship with him. He evangelized. He left to Asia, in particular India. He was in Kerala. He was in Goa. But I was reading his writings during the long retreat, the 30-day silent retreat, and I was surprised to read some of his words about the Indian people, about how they're just not fit for the priesthood, that he actually used some pretty, what we would today very much say are racially motivated terms. And I actually was bifurcating in my head, almost compartmentalizing would be the better word, what he was saying about them, and translating that to mean, well, that's not me. That was those people over there. That's not me. I'm Americanized. I'm from a totally different upbringing. And it wasn't until decades later I realized how wrong that was. How wrong, while this is a saint, he's also a sinner, and how there's these words that he had were rooted in sin, in the, whether it be the implicit bias, but all of this is rooted in the sin of racism. How was I able to reconcile it? One is to call these things out, put it in the open, and just say it for what it is. And then two, kind of taking that step back and realizing, well, my faith is in God, my faith is in Christ, my faith is in the Holy Trinity, and really just kind of separating the human and the divine, if you will, understanding, yes, Christ founded the church and he entrusted it to sinful human beings. And while the Spirit is with us and moving among us, amid sinful human beings who have free will, there's going to be problems. And so I really stem my faith in scripture, tradition, the Trinity. And when I see or hear things that happen in the church, I've kind of come to a growing place of differentiating those acts as not being central to how I see my faith, those acts as being quite the opposite, deviant of the faith. And I try not to allow that to discourage me, but to only turn me back to who is the source of my faith, and to not do what those examples are doing, but to try to be more like Christ, and also kind of look at myself and what are areas where I'm deviating, and how can I also be more like Christ. So it's definitely a reckoning. I think the most important thing is not to sweep it under the rug, not to pretend like it doesn't exist, not to explain it away, but to call it for what it is, and also differentiate that this is not representative of Christ. This is not representative of the Trinitarian love that we've been given at baptism, that we've been created with, that we've been bestowed as children of God with inherent dignity just by God's breath of life in us. So that's how I've approached it.
Okay. And I think I also had to have a reckoning with my own faith when I was writing my book and learning about this history, because it's not easy. And like you said, I don't think it should be swept under the rug. And I think that reparations do need to be made um, through the church because of the sin and what has happened. But I also had to think, okay, the slave trade, the African European slave trade started in the late 1400s. The church had been around for 1400 years before that. So we can't say that Jesus was the slave trade, even if it was popes that were gave the seminal blessing, and even if it was, majority Catholic countries that were doing it. Jesus had in our church, in our tradition, and our saints had been around for a long time before that. So I think that's one thing that I had to appreciate, that I had to separate the some of the terrible things that the church has done, which have been terrible, and separate that from Jesus, who founded our church. Um, so shifting to the present, you have a chapter called Empty Words and Empty Promises, where you discuss that the USCCB, the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, makes statements but doesn't actually always live up to them. So can you discuss that a bit?
Sure. And as I reflect on this, it also ties into your first question in terms of 2020 and speaking out on anti-Black racism. When George Floyd was murdered, I had naively assumed that there would be a ton of bishops speaking out about it. So I was looking up statements by prominent bishops and found very little. Maybe a certain bishop, like Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso, did something very wonderful where he and several priests knelt down in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and the people who were protesting against the death of George Floyd and so many others. But what I did discover, what actually set me on the path, was I discovered a writing by a certain bishop where he was actually speaking out against social justice and racial justice movements, and that just kind of stirred within me, and I said I had to respond to that, and so I wrote an article in response to that, got that published, and then there was just so much more that was welling up in me, and I started to research what bishops were saying and doing, and what bishops were not saying and what they were not doing. That started my trajectory in terms of my social outreach or social justice, was writing about what's going on and why this is wrong and why this is wrong in light of our faith. And the more I got into it, the more I discovered. Reading the writings of Father Brian Massingale, he does a great job with his exposition of the various encyclicals that have dealt with racism. And his book was written 10 years prior, so it didn't include the more recent one, Open Wide, that happened after the Charlottesville massacre. And that letter was interesting from various respects. There was Eric Martin who wrote an article in Sojourners that talked about the white power element that was influencing the bishops as they were drafting this article. There was a bishop that really wanted to call out certain symbols of racism and denounce them, such as a Confederate flag, such as nooses. And then another bishop, and I say a group of bishops, wanted to not include that wording, not to include that strong of wording. And when this information got out, it had such a strong kind of reverberation response that there was pressure from Sojourners to take down the article. Then there was a staff, I guess, revolt, if you will, that they were against what was going on. They were protesting. People were leaving Sojourners, and then they finally put the article back on. But that kind of clued into me that.
So some of the people were resigning in protest because the article got taken down.
Correct. Yeah. And just the way that they handled the whole situation. And it clued me into.
I believe that they should have the truth out there, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And it clued me into that, unfortunately, the bishops really haven't been on the side of the people of God in this area of racism, racial justice. If anything, they've made attempts, but as I kind of just did my own reading and analysis of each of the different letters, and each and every one just fell short. The first one just wasn't well promulgated. The second one had all these great ideals, but then when it came to actually allocating money toward racial justice, they just didn't. Well, when it comes to the Catholic Church, you can follow the money, and that's where we can see where the priorities are, unfortunately, in this human institution, or the human element of the institution. But really, the Open Wide, that really struck the most with me, because there were so many opportunities, just given what was going on in the country, not just Charlottesville, yes, but the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, the aftermath thereafter. They really had a platform and a means and a way to really make a very comprehensive denouncement of racism, of white nationalism, of white supremacy, and they wouldn't do it. They just wouldn't go there. And there was a couple different sources point out that they believe that the reason is, again, goes back to money. Where is the money coming from? Do they want to harm the donor base? And then there's also the factor of, I believe I saw a statistic, 88% of the U.S. bishops are white Americans. So there's a lack of an understanding, a lack of solidarity with the experience of Black Americans, with that of Asian Americans, South Asian Americans, the people, descendants of Central South America, Mexico. And so from that regard, there's just this big disconnect of people in the hierarchy who don't have our backs. And the wording and the message of the encyclicals only reinforce that, sadly.
Well, I know our time together is coming to an end, but I just wanted to ask one last question that I think both of us could answer. So, there was a lot of focus during 2020 on anti-Black racism and like being inclusive of all people of color. But from your perspective, has the conversation changed since then? And if so, in what ways? And do you think that we've seen sustained change since 2020, or do you think that we're kind of going backward?
Yeah, this is something I've been reflecting on. I know 2020, 2021, there was a lot of focus on the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the justice against the Derek Chauvin. But I feel like 2023, present year, there isn't as much talk or as much discourse around that. In some ways, I've seen the discourse not necessarily that it's stopped completely, but potentially it's just shifted in other areas where now it's the Palestine-Israel conflict, and a lot of people who are speaking strongly against anti-Black racism are now also speaking out against what's going on with the Palestinian people. So in that regard, it might just be a shift of what's current. That being said, I don't want the message to all of a sudden seem like it's not relevant, because it is, and because it's still happening. It might not be necessarily hitting the news all the time, but you do a really good job of putting on Instagram the various instances where like, a young Black teen gets shot by a police officer, and the teen doesn't have any weapons. So I see a couple different elements, but what I predominantly see on social media is still this kind of overarching Catholic movement against any sort of discourse on racial justice and supporting those who are racially oppressed. And that is something that I feel like we can't just let that be kind of swept under the rug or just moved aside. If anything, it calls for more works like yours, like mine, like the other people you mentioned, to keep bringing the conversation to the table.
Absolutely. And I like recently Roger Fortson, who was a airman in the US, was killed in his apartment by the police. And it for me, it's kind of like there is no outrage really for that type of murder. So in some ways, we're right back where we were at in 2020 before that, before it was a 15-year-old boy who had autism who was killed. Um, so it's like, for me, I feel like a lot of people have moved past being outraged about this type of stuff. And I'm still there, you know. I still think it's important that we talk about it. I still think we need to push for police reform. I still think we need to put more money towards social services, education, job training, equal opportunities for everyone. So yeah, for me, I think that 2020, although it was a moment in time that has passed, the pressing issues are still with us today and still demand our attention. So I want to thank you again so much for joining me. I have both of our books here in the shadow. Oh, sorry. In the Shadow of Freedom, my book, and The Catholic Church and the Struggle for Racial Justice. And I'm going to link to both of these in the description. So, yeah, I just want to thank you so much for joining me. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe.
Thank you so much, Alessandro, for your time.